Stephen, you're in my mind, you're the sort of great philosopher of optimism. Is this an optimistic book? Is this a clarion call for us to recognise just how rational a species we are?
I resist the label optimist because in my past books, like The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, I didn't so much call for seeing the glasses half full or looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but rather just being aware of a source of information that people are generally unaware of, and that is data on the state of the world and how it's changed, as opposed to the daily headlines. It is tied to one of the themes of rationality, namely, one of the strongest cognitive biases is to base your estimate of probability or risk or danger on vivid anecdotes, incidents that are easily available from memory. And of course, that's what the news provides. But you can lose sight of sweeping developments across the world that just don't happen to take place in headlines. So if every year the extreme poverty rate goes down by a few percentage points, there's never a day in October in which that generates a headline, but it can transform the world. Likewise, if there are whole regions of the world that haven't been at war for 40 years, again, not being at war is not a headline, but we can fail to recognize that the world has actually changed. So I don't consider that optimism. I just consider it really reality-based and overcoming a pessimism bias that's just baked into the nature of news. But there's no question that bad things can happen. We're living through several of them right now.
So explain, what's the thesis of your book then? To get listeners across this, if you wouldn't mind, that we are a rational species.
We're certainly capable of rationality. If we weren't, we would not have any benchmarks or yardsticks by which we could claim that people are irrational. Irrational compared to what? Well, compared to standards of rationality. Who came up with them? Well, it wasn't Martians. It was humans who figured out what the correct answer to problems is. So, and I think we are capable of rationality, but it doesn't come easy. We naturally fall back in certain ways of thinking, and we're rooted in our day-to-day existence. I think we're perfectly rational about how to keep food in the refrigerator and getting the kids off to school on time. We kind of have to be, because if we weren't, reality would punish us. The laws of logic really are the laws of logic. On the other hand, when it comes to political issues and historical and philosophical and cosmic and theological, we tend to fall back on uplifting myths. The idea from science, from journalism, from historians, that you can actually find out what happened, what is happening, even at the microscopic level, what causes diseases, the cosmic level, where did humans come from. It's really recent in human history that we've even been able to answer these questions. Science is a recent invention, and the human mind hasn't really caught up. We still think that when it comes to these big issues, any story that makes you feel good is as good as any other story.
So are we getting better or worse, is I suppose the thing that follows from that? Are we more rational or less rational now?
The way I think of it is that we have more rationality inequality. At the top end, we've never been so rational. We invented vaccines for COVID in less than a year. Our computers and smartphones get smarter and smarter. We probe distant galaxies. So at the pinnacle of human rationality, we're better than ever. We're also better at applying rationality in areas that used to be just a matter of hunches and guesswork and intuition and personal experience. Like medicine increasingly is actually bringing evidence to bear on whether various treatments work or don't. It turns out that doctors would prescribe things that their teachers told them, and no one ever bothered to check whether they work or not. That's changing in medicine. It's changing in policy. More and more policy analysts, instead of announcing some nostrum that's going to cure, poverty or traffic or whatever, they actually look at studies to see whether these things work or not. In sports, teams now have statisticians. So at the top end, there's a lot of rationality. At the bottom end, it's not clear that things are getting worse, but they certainly aren't getting better. We've got conspiracy theories, some of them completely wacko, like the QAnon theory popular in the United States. We've got quack cures and homeopathy and crystal healing powers and astrology. I don't know if they've gotten worse because people have always believed in them. People have always spread rumors about conspiracies. They've often started wars and pogroms and even genocides. We've always believed in miracles. What are the legacy religions but tales of the paranormal spread as fake news? So it's disappointing we haven't done better at making the entire culture more rational. There's a lot of diversity, let's put it that way.
Here's an argument for why it might have got worse. The sort of what we might call the curse of postmodernism, which is a sort of which I know you talk about in the book. This idea that once you start questioning authority, which is a healthy thing to do, and actually has led to all sorts of progress over the last 300 or 400 years. The Enlightenment is a questioning of authority, some people might say. But if you live in a world where everything is questioned, you actually lose some authorities that might actually be giving you facts, might actually be behaving rationally. And if everybody can be questioned, there's an argument that everyone can be disbelieved, and therefore people who actually behave rationally are put on the same level as people who behave irrationally.
No, that's an excellent point, and you're right that skepticism is essential to rationality, simply because no human is infallible, no human is omniscient. One always has to question the belief of charismatic leaders, and one always has to question one's own beliefs, because none of us, despite the fact that it always feels good to be right, but none of us is always right. So that kind of skepticism is indispensable. On the other hand, some sources of information really are more credible than others, that we should calibrate our belief to the strength of the evidence, sometimes called Bayesian reasoning in one of the chapters in my book, Rationality. And to just say, well, anyone can believe anything they want, it's all a bunch of competing narratives, is a road to irrationality.
Yeah.
The problem is that that's intuitively very compelling when it comes to these beliefs about big cosmic issues, about who really has power, where does fortune and misfortune come from. The natural human tendency is to think, well, any narrative is as good as any other, depending on what moral agenda it serves. And what postmodernism has done is it's taken that human intuition that it's easy to fall back on and made it official doctrine.
Yeah.
Kind of backed it up with arguments.
And the problem is that can bleed into the political sphere, can't it? We've been talking about on this program, there's a quote that I think Khrushchev said at some point, but it's become a sort of political truth that if someone is worried about an imaginary river, you don't tell them the river is imaginary, you build them an imaginary bridge. But this notion that when ideology hits reality,
Yes.
you don't say reality is right and the ideology might be suspect. You actually say, well, maybe that version of reality is wrong. Maybe actually the story that you're telling is wrong. And the rational response is to look at evidence, to look at accepted evidence, to test it. But it comes back to this point that if there is no authority, you can't actually work out what's evidence and what's the story.
Well, yes, and in fact, that is deployed strategically by certain political leaders to, as Steve Bannon admiringly put it, to flood the zone with human waste, although he didn't use the word human waste. That is to not so much to construct a coherent but false narrative, but rather to issue so many statements, they might even contradict each other, that no one knows what to believe, and so you may as well believe the charismatic leader. That is to undermine all grounds for evidence-based objective reality. So that is a tactic of Trump, it's a tactic of Putin, it's a tactic of certain authoritarian populists, as opposed to the strategy that we ought to deploy if we were rational, namely that none of us is infallible, but we ought to look at the best evidence and calibrate our policies to our best assessment of reality, and that there are ways of doing so. It isn't just that anyone's narrative is as good as any other one. Science proves it. The fact that science really does give us antibiotics and planetary probes and smartphones and things that demonstrably work, those can't just be any old narratives. Those are narratives that actually work. So it suggests that objective reality can be attained. It's not easy, not always, but science is an existence proof.
So when I was growing up, there was a phrase which they may well not play on the radio: "Bullshit baffles brains."
Can you say it on the radio?
Yeah,
here?
I don't know if I can, but that sentiment, the
Yes.
idea that actually it's harder to convince people of the truth than it is to convince them of a myth.
Yes, well, that is true. I don't think that's true of everything. I mean, people, when it comes to objects in front of you, when it comes to whether there's petrol in the car, people are pretty sensitive to objective reality because they have to be. If they weren't, reality would punish them. But in areas where you can't really tell very easily, you can, if you're a scientist, if you're a historian, if you're a journalist, you believe that you can tell with a lot of effort, or at least you can make your best attempt, and that some efforts are better than others. But the natural human intuition is no one can tell. Let's believe what makes our side look good.
And that's the problem. I don't know if it's possible to talk about this, but I'm fascinated by a thing you mentioned in the book, and I've never understood this: the Monty Hall problem.
Oh, yes.
Because now maybe I'm not sufficiently good on statistics and maths, but it does illustrate an issue, doesn't it? That there is an intuitive feeling for something, there is a statistical reality, and the two aren't necessarily the same thing. And how do we get better at looking at what the scientific facts tell us? Do you want to tell us what the Monty Hall problem is?
Indeed, it is based on an American game show. There are 3 doors. The contestant, but behind 2 of them are goats. Behind one of them is a luxury car. The contestant picks a door. The host of the show, Monty Hall, then opens one of the other 2 doors, the one that the contestant has not picked, offering the contestant an opportunity to switch his choice if he wants to. Now, the question is, ought he to switch? That is, should he pick the remaining unopened door? Most people say, well, it doesn't matter. The car is behind whatever door it's behind, and opening one door isn't going to move the car around, so you should just, it
might as
doesn't
well
matter.
stick.
Might as well stick. The correct answer is you should switch. And if you don't believe it, you can either...
I don't believe it. I don't.
Yeah, well, you could try it. You could actually play the game online,
Yeah.
count up the number of times in which you get a car or a goat, and you'll find that you get the car twice as often.
So there's 3 doors.
3 doors.
One is opened.
Yeah.
That shows a goat.
Yeah.
So you've got 2 left.
Right. The one you picked.
The one you picked
and another one. Another one that you can switch to or not.
And the feeling would be, the car's not moving, there's 2 left, I've got a 50% chance of getting it right, and therefore my first chance might be correct, and the 50% chance, or the other one might be correct, but there's no point in moving. But that's not true.
That is not true. So it's not true, logically. And if you don't believe the logic, try it.
Do you understand the logic?
Yeah, I do.
Can you explain the logic in a way that someone as dim as I would be able to understand?
It's not just you. One of the world's most brilliant mathematicians, Paul Erdos, refused to believe it and did what mathematicians never do, which is change his mind based on actually playing it out and counting up the outcomes. Yes. If you're a mathematician, you've got to deduce it as a theorem. It's actually rather déclassé to actually count things up in the world, but that's what he was forced to because it was so unintuitive even to him. The basic idea is that probability is not about the world. It's about your knowledge about the world. And anything that reduces your ignorance changes the probability and therefore changes the odds if you're making a risky choice. In the case of opening one of the 2 unopened doors, Monty Hall is giving you information. Namely, he decided not to open the 3rd door. He could have, he didn't. Now, by the way, it's part of the rules, of course, of the game that he never opens a door revealing a car.
Yeah, exactly.
Then the game would be over. And Monty knows which door the car is behind.
Right.
He has now shared with you some of his knowledge. It would be foolish not to take it into account. Now, it doesn't guarantee that you'll win, but it doubles your odds. But the key insight is that probability is a matter of knowledge and ignorance and information. It's not a matter of the state of the world.
And that's not a terrible metaphor for the book. It really isn't. The idea that there are some things out there which our brains can and should cling to. And I suppose we should end this thing with this notion of what can we do to get this better? Can we teach rationality? Can we improve our rationality? Can we challenge irrationality?
Well, I kind of hope so, because that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I do believe that these kinds of things ought to be taught in school. But school is not enough, and as much as I will push my book, it's not enough. It can't just be up to individuals, because even the most rational of us is not infallible. We have to join institutions, communities that have rules that steer everyone toward objective truth, despite the fact that no one on their own can hope to attain it. Rules like free speech, open criticism and debate, fact-checking, editing. Namely, it can't just be up to one person to promote their truth. We have to surrender to the rules of a game that will allow us collectively to be more rationally than any of us is individually.
And individually, we should say to ourselves, we shouldn't just believe things because they make us feel good, or because we happen to agree with them.
The world doesn't care how we feel, but we ought to calibrate our beliefs to the evidence, and there are rational ways of doing so.
And I know you don't like to talk about being optimistic, but are you optimistic that we can get better at this, that this is something that we can improve on? Or does the new world of hypercommunication, where we share and we get involved in tribes and all of the new way we conduct ourselves now in a technological world, does that make us less likely to do the right thing?
So there is a tension, and the reason for optimism is despite all of these biases and fallacies and blunders that are kind of baked into us by the limitations of our brain, we also have an incentive to find out the truth because the truth is the truth and it'll punish us for not believing in it. And so there's always a force that pulls us toward greater rationality, namely getting what we want in a world that's unforgiving, that operates according to its own laws. If we disregard those laws, we'll be worse off.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's something to cling to, perhaps. Stephen, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.